and welcome to this week's Masterpiece Monday. Today I will be discussing the central panel of an altarpiece originally commissioned for the Church of All Saints, Ognissanti, in Florence, Italy by Giotto di Bondonne, known more commonly just as Giotto. It is tempera on wood and obviously includes some gold leaf. So when people think of the Renaissance, they usually associate it with Michelangelo, with Raphael, with Leonardo, with Donatello, and they would be correct to do so. But this really is just one piece of the Renaissance. This would be the high Renaissance that people generally think of when they think of Renaissance, especially Renaissance Italian art. And this is a very narrow period, really between the late 15th and the early 16th century. But the seeds of the Renaissance in Italy are sown much earlier, as the date on this particular piece can attest, 1310. So let's talk about the beginnings of the Renaissance, the early Renaissance in Italy. So the situation in Italy, especially at the beginning of the 13th century, was politically extremely fractured, but was dominated by the Holy Roman Empire and even more so the papacy. However, the strength of the papacy was really undermined when its seat moved from Rome to Avignon in France in the 14th century. The pontiff no longer had as much power and control as he once did when he was in Rome in the Vatican. As a result, we see sort of a space for power. And we see the rise of wealthy city-states ruled by oligarchies emerge in Italy. These oligarchies, wealthy families, rise to prominence in places like Florence, Siena, Pisa, and Venice. These city-states were constantly vying with each other for wealth and power. The competitive spirit also manifested culturally and artistically because oligarchs become patrons of the saints. It's just another form of competition. Who can commission more art? Who can snag the best, most skilled, most popular, trendiest artist at the time to create a work for them or to be sort of an in-house artist for them? And obviously, the more pieces that you commission, the more cultured you are, the more wealth you have. So obviously, the arts become just another outlet for this competitive spirit. Culturally, at this time, we see the influence of several enduring aesthetics. The first one being the Byzantine Empire, which was centered on the Bosphorus in Constantinople in Turkey. And then the second stylistic aesthetic that we continue to see being influential is the French Gothic style. So it's a late medieval style, think Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, France. Philosophically, though, this is really an important avenue of investigation to understand the changes that are so significant between medieval art and early Renaissance art, specifically seen in Giotto's paintings. Philosophically, during the 14th century, there is a renewed interest in the creative works of the individual as opposed to a king or the gods or the Judeo-Christian God. Inspired by writers like Dante and Petrarch and Boccaccio, 14th century thinkers studied ancient writers. They studied ancient historians, rhetoricians, artists, and specifically looked to ancient artists like Polyclitus, the sculptor, Cicero, the famous orator, Virgil, who composed epics, and Seneca, who championed civic and personal virtues. And by doing so, these humanists, as they called themselves, revived the classics. And in this way, they expressed a new interest in the search for moral clarity as an attempt to find solutions to the modern problems that plague society through ancient logic. They tried other things. They've tried church. They've tried the Roman Catholic faith. And it's certainly not as if they're abandoning it, but they're recognizing that maybe there are other options for trying to understand and solve the problems of the contemporary world and contemporary society. So these men, as I mentioned, were called humanists. We often position this new interest in the experience of the individual as a secular pursuit. However, it was anything but secular. Rather, it focused on the relation of man to the divine, seeing in human beings as the purpose and perfect epitome of God's creation. And hence, again, they called themselves humanists because the focus was on humans. So humanism is first and foremost a religious and educational or an intellectual movement. It is not a secular one, and I can't emphasize that enough. So simplistically, a good definition, a working definition of humanism is the renewed interest in Greek and Roman literature, art, and philosophy with an emphasis on science, on reason, increased observation of the natural world, the potential of the individual, and the experience of the individual. And why this emphasis on the individual or interest in the individual? Well, humanists believe that the individual had the potential to better the state through civic virtue and involvement, even by just simply being a patron of the arts or being an informed politician or member of the government. But again, all of this is being done with a backdrop of Christianity. So humanists were also syncretists. That is, that they believed that religious truth could be and was revealed to everyone, regardless of your religious affiliation, Christian and non-Christian alike. So that part of the goal or the charge of the humanists was to conform non-Christian thinkers and thinking to Christian thinking, and to show the similarities between non-Christian philosophies and religions and Christian philosophies and religion. So when you make something feel familiar, people are more likely to buy in, to subscribe. And how do you do this? Well, you show and you tell. You do it through art, you do it through literature, you do it through theater. And maybe the bigger question is, why do you do this? Well, again, it's to try and improve your society, try and make your city state, whether it's Florence or Pisa, that much greater, that much more competitive, right? So humanist ideas are reflected in the art of the 14th century through the incorporation of such Greek and Roman interests as the representation of nature, as well as the human body through direct observation, and through the interest in exploring mythological subjects, subjects from Homer, subjects from Virgil, subjects from mythology and from the hymns. So we see a lot of representations of gods and goddesses and the origin stories of gods and goddesses. So now let's look at this particular altarpiece by Giotto. Giotto was famous in and of his own right, which is unusual, and I'll come back to that in just a second. But he's mentioned in La Divina Commedia by Dante as possibly being an even greater painter than Cimabue, who is also a very well-known Italian painter. I will also come back to Cimabue in just a second, because I do want to show one of his paintings as a point of comparison for this one. But Giotto is believed to be the student of Cimabue's, and this is based on similarities between their painting styles, particularly their composition, the treatment of the figures, and their use of color. But Giotto he sort of takes his style a little bit further into the more naturalistic realm than Cimabue does. But why was Giotto so famous? Maybe more so, according to Dante, than Cimabue, or at least that he deserves sort of greater and more accolades. And this is because he introduces incredible naturalism to painting through direct observation. And while I keep harping on this idea of direct observation, it really is important. I talked about it for those of you who listened to last week's Masterpiece Monday, in relationship to Caravaggio and his use of models, live models. The use of live models, especially in 1310, was it was a totally different type of artistic pursuit. Normally, you did not work from a live model. And this is based on the fact that during the medieval period, which came, just before this, artists were not looking at live models. They were not working from live human breathing bodies. The body was a repository of original sin, unless it was not something to be revealed. It was not something to be studied or celebrated. So we don't see people, they're working from memory, right? And when they did represent the human body, it was extremely schematic. It was very flat. It was enveloped in drapery. You didn't get a sense of parts at all. You just saw sort of a head, maybe some hands and some feet sticking out. But exactly what was happening between the neck and the tips of the toes was anybody's guess. what we see here is very, very different. Here, Mary is presented as the central figure on a throne as the Queen of Heaven. She is a monumental virgin. Her body has weight, actual mass, and is aware of the space that it occupies. She has volume. She's surrounded by angels, all turned to view her, and she's presenting us with the Christ child. The Virgin and Christ are further emphasized by Giotto's use of light, which was very clever. They're bathed in light through careful attention to shading and highlighting. Like Caravaggio, he uses light to model his figures, not contour lines. So, because of his expert use of light, his figures appear more modeled, more three-dimensional. Further, Giotto shows more of an interest in the rendering of space. The throne that Mary sits on is articulated to form a niche that encloses and separates both Mary and Christ and sets them apart from the rest of the crowd, the angels that surround them. This and the overlapping of many of the figures attempt to suggest to the viewer that this is actual space that is inhabited and inhabitable, right? You could step into this scene, right? And while you may not ever access Mary, you certainly can step into the scene. You understand that this step takes you up to this step, and that these figures here of the angels are in front of these figures in the back. And it's not just because they are a stacked rows of heads, which is something that we see in earlier representations of a similar scene. So we can also see the humanist interest in the celebration of the individual through a greater range of poses and views of the accompanying figures than previous altarpieces. Additionally, each of their faces is individualized. That's significant, especially if you look at Byzantine and medieval mosaics, which, yes, it's a difficult medium to work with, but individuality is absolutely achievable. And that's not something you see. To distinguish one figure from another, oftentimes it's just done through clothing. This is done through actual physical features in the faces, through the shape and size of their bodies. And so there is this attempt at individuality. Again, the celebration of the individual as an individual is something that's very important to humanists. So as a point of comparison, I want to show you something that likely inspired Giotto, possibly even Cimabue trained Giotto as a painter. But this is a similar altarpiece, a Maestà, from just a few years earlier, 1280. And I think if I show them to you side by side, you can see just how different in terms of the rendering of space and the modeling of figures and the use of light, how different these two panels are, both from altarpieces. Cimabue's here is on the right. In terms of space, it's much flatter. It has a much harder time tricking your eye into believing that this is potentially or could be a three-dimensional space, right? Rendered on a two-dimensional plane. And part of the reason why is because of the incredible use of gold. We call this style maniera greca, that is in the manner of the Greeks. It has clear Byzantine influence. Where you have this sort of halo right here, that's this very articulated little line. Frontality, the figures are all sort of plastered to the front of the picture plane. There's this flatness that's very palpable. Everything looks like it's sort of been just like pushed right up to a window. Lots of gold. Forms are not modeled for the most part. They are created through the use of line. However, I will say that the figure of Mary here, and even of Christ, you can see lines certainly, but you also see the attempt at creating form underneath of some of those lines. So this is an interesting intermediary between what you would see during the Byzantine period or during the medieval period, and then something like Giotto's, where clearly, yes, lines are used, but obviously you can see that he's using light to accentuate the knees here, light to accentuate her breasts, light to create these sort of rounded forms here. And even sort of the drapery as it lays over Christ here, it's diaphanous, right? And it accentuates the parts of Christ's body so that you understand that underneath of this, he has little chubby legs and chubby thighs, right? And he's got a baby's body. So this Italo-Byzantine style of Cimabues is retained somewhat in Giotto's painting. That is, you have this flat field of gold in the background, right? That doesn't go away. You have this articulated space, the steps, the use of sort of faux um, marbling effect here to show the use of precious stone in this sort of throne that she's sitting in. The gold of the halos, certainly. And even just sort of the arrangement of the figures is very different in this too, right? Here you have the stacking of the angels, right? Everybody has to have their space, right? Here you have figures obscured one by the other. So there's this understanding of the recession of space. Um, so while Cimabues does show some observation of the natural world, some naturalism, some attempt to render the figures in this and the space as if it were an actual space and actual figures as they look in sort of the real world in life, you don't get that same sense of naturalism as you do in Giotto's. Is it photorealism? Absolutely not. But you can definitely see how things are sort of progressing. We're doing away with lines as a way, contour lines as a way of defining one figure from another, and moving toward the use of light and shadow to model these two figures. As always, I would appreciate your comments on this post on Facebook. Feel free again to email me if you have any recommendations or suggestions for pieces or styles that you might like me to discuss. You can email me at cccmasterpiecemondays@gmail.com. I look forward to talking with you next week about an entirely new. Thank you.